This is chapter 23. It deals with several different things: parasitic protozoans, helminths, which are worms, and also diseases that are caused due to vectors, specifically arthropod vectors. In the field of parasitology, you're often looking at parasites that are either protozoan or helminthic. These exist throughout the world. They're often in areas where people are very crowded together. Sometimes it can be in more rural areas, undeveloped areas. One of the common factors, whether it's a rural area or overcrowded, is that there tends to be poor sanitary conditions, maybe poor water supplies. There's not means of trying to control the vectors that act in transmitting the disease from one host to another. This is becoming more and more of a problem in several different countries. And once again, a lot of it has to do with trying to control that vector, that connecting chain, link in the chain, if you will. Oftentimes, parasitic infections involve several different hosts. There's a definitive host and an intermediate host. Once again, if you can break that chain, that's going to be huge in helping to control it. And how are humans infected by parasites? Oftentimes by ingesting contaminated water, contaminated food, direct contact, or it's transmitted by a vector, usually an insect. This just shows the different routes in which humans can be infected with parasites, either contact with the eyes, through the skin, inhaling it, that fecal oral transmission, sexual contact, or with a vector. So a vector is any animal that's going to carry the pathogen. Like I said, arthropods, insects, are going to be the most common one. So that, once again, in terms of epidemiology and trying to control, if you can control that vector and prevent it from transmitting to the humans, that's a huge step. Protozoans, if you remember, are eukaryotes. However, they're unicellular. They don't really fit in with any other groups. They usually can enter the body either by ingesting food that's been contaminated or water that's been contaminated. And the protozoan itself can live in a couple different forms. They kind of cycle back and forth between two morphological forms. The first one, the trophozoite, is the feeding and reproductive stage. This is the stage that it will be within the host. The cyst form is usually how it survives in the environment, and that's the form that it's in when a human becomes infected. And then once the cyst is inside the host, the cyst kind of breaks apart, develops into the trophocyte, which is when it's going to feed, reproduce, and then it forms a cyst around it before it leaves the host, typically in the feces. The protozoan parasites are, parasites typically are going to be grouped according to their mode of locomotion. We talk first with the ciliates. They will use, as the name implies, cilia to move. The only known ciliate that causes human disease is Plasmodium coli. It's usually found in intestine tracts of animals. Humans become infected when they've consumed contaminated food or water. Like I say, usually the infective stage is with the cyst, and then the cyst basically is removed, becomes a trophocyte, which then attaches to the epithelial lining in the intestines typically. In healthy adults, the infection stage usually is asymptomatic. If an individual is already immunocompressed, is in poor health, then it can develop into the full-blown disease where the symptoms are going to be diarrhea, abdominal pain, and weight loss. If it's very severe, it can progress to the point of causing dysentery. So in terms of diagnostic purposes, you would look for the trophocytes in a stool sample, and you can use antibiotics such as tetracycline to help treat it. The prevention, and you're going to hear this over and over, but prevention deals with having good personal hygiene, proper water sanitation, cook your food properly. Amoebas don't really have a definite shape to them. They move by using their pseudopods, the little extensions, and then the rest of the cytoplasm kind of flows towards it. They're found in water. Very few of them cause disease. One that can cause disease, typically seen in less developed countries, would be Entamoeba histolytica. Usually it causes infection because somebody has consumed contaminated water. The type of infection depends on where the amoeba basically ends up. Luminal is going to be asymptomatic in a healthy individual. If it's invasive amoebic dysentery, symptoms are going to be severe diarrhea, appendicitis, etc. If it's in the blood, it's referred to as invasive extraintestinal, and this, because it's in the blood, can lead to additional problems. If left untreated, can be fatal. This is what it looks like in a fecal smear. So you would, for diagnosis, you would look at stool samples, and then there's a couple of different antibiotics you can use to treat it. If someone obviously is having severe diarrhea, you also want to be treating with increasing fluid intake, keep them hydrated. Once again, it's usually the infection usually occurs by consuming contaminated water. So if you can have a clean drinking water supply, that will provide for prevention. A couple of other amoebas are fairly rare, but when they do cause infection, they can cause brain infections, which are usually going to be fatal. These are commonly found in water systems. The one that I really want to mention, even though it's not quite as common as the other, is Naegleria. This is an infection. Usually people are swimming in contaminated water. The symptoms usually start fairly quickly and very quickly can lead to hemorrhaging, coma, and then death. And unfortunately, this is something we've seen in the past few years, an increase in the number of cases of the Naegleria. Oftentimes where you hear of someone who is swimming in a pond, freshwater lake, etc., and they've consumed some of that contaminated water. There are some drugs that you can try, like, say, unfortunately for the Naegleria, the symptoms usually appear very quickly and the infection is often diagnosed too late for any successful treatment. Because the organisms are in the environment, they're very widespread. Prevention is difficult. Now, if you are swimming, like in a swimming pool, obviously that water needs to be cleaned and maintained on a very regular basis. Samples should be taken to make sure that your cleaning process is effective. If you're swimming out in the environment in a pond or something, right now I guess the best advice would be keep your mouth closed. Flagellates, these are protozoans that will have at least one flagella for movement. We often will determine species by the number and the arrangement of those flagella. Trypanosoma cruzi is the causative agent of Chagas disease. This is endemic in Central and South America. As you can see, there are primary reservoirs are the possums and armadillos. Transmission is because of an insect that transmits from the primary reservoir to the human, typically referred to as the kissing bug, where the bug becomes infected with the parasites and then it bites the human. If the human is infected, then it can also then transmit to the kissing bug, which then transmits to someone else. There's 4 general stages of Chagas disease. In the last stage, oftentimes what we tend to see ultimately is the patient develops congestive heart failure. This is actually one of the leading causes of death in Latin America is parasite-induced heart disease. In a blood smear, you can clearly see within the red blood cells the parasite in here. So you would identify it typically diagnostically by looking at a stain. Early stages can be treated with a couple of different antibiotics. If it has progressed to the later stages, however, at that point, there is no effective treatment. So the best prevention method is, once again, break that link with the insect so it cannot act as a vector. Another type of species of flagellus, Trichomonas Vaginalis, which is causative agent of African sleeping sickness. The insect vector here is the tsetse fly. Once again, humans become infected when the insect bites them. You can see once again the progression or life cycle of the parasite between the human and the fly. Once again, if you can break that link and prevent ever the infection from occurring would be the best thing. If left untreated, death can occur within a few months of the onset of the disease. Early stages can be treated with several different types of antibiotics. Once again, the number of disease cases can be reduced when you have very active reduction in basically the insect population. There have been some studies where they have released the male flies that are sterile, and that has been successful in reducing and almost eradicating the tsetse flies in certain areas. Leishmania is endemic in parts of the tropic and subtropic areas. Other hosts are also dogs, small rodents. Typically, there's 2 different developmental stages, which is often seen with any of the parasites. Once again, there's 3 different clinical forms. Cutaneous, as the name implies, tends to form ulcers on the skin from where the bite occurred. Mucocutaneous is where the skin lesions tend to also enlarge and will also involve the mucous membranes, typically on the mouth, the nose, or the soft palate. And then the visceral form is where the parasite has now been transmitted to the liver, the spleen, the bone marrow, and the lymph nodes. If this occurs and treatment is not done, as you can see, the mortality rate is extremely high, about 95%. This is an example of the mucocutaneous form where it has infected not only the skin, but like I said, the mucous membranes in the mouth. You can do immunoassays to confirm the diagnosis. Most cases will be relatively small. They'll heal on their own. Visceral, however, like I said, if left untreated, has a very high mortality rate. So that definitely needs to be treated and there's a combination of various antibiotics that can be used. Once again, prevention for any disease is the best thing, and here we'll see again is cut that link, reduce the exposure to the vector. Giardia is the causative agent of giardiosis. This is a very common, we refer to it as a gastrointestinal disease here in the United States. What happens is you ingest the cyst, typically in contaminated water, sometimes contaminated food, and some people, if they've only ingested a few cysts, may remain asymptomatic. However, typically what happens is people have ingested several, and it progresses to the full-blown disease, which is going to be diarrhea, pain, bloating, nausea, vomiting, fever, or what we used to call extreme intestinal distress. This shows the life cycle of this. Giardia can be diagnosed by identification of seeing the cyst in the stool and identifying by DNA analysis. There's different antibiotics that can be used to treat it. To prevent the infection, once again, have clean water. This is the one that oftentimes people will contract it when they are out hiking or camping in backcountry and they choose to just drink straight from, say, a mountain stream. You don't know what has been deposited upstream. It may look clear, but it doesn't mean that that water is clean. So a lot of your seasoned hikers or backpackers have learned carry either chlorine tablets to try to purify the water or filter. Use a filter apparatus so that you're drinking filtered water. It filters the Giardia out. It will filter those cysts out so that you will not contract the disease. Trichomonas, there's a couple different species. Trichomonas vaginalis is the most common one causing human disease in your industrial nations. It does live in the GI tracts of both male and females. It's transmitted via sex. In women, it can cause vaginosis. Men typically are going to be asymptomatic. Even though they are asymptomatic, they can transmit to the partner. Infections can be treated with various antibiotics. Prevention would involve safe sex practices or abstinence. And this shows the causative agent. As you can see, it does have flagella, and typically multiple flagella. Apicomplexans, we're still talking about protozoans, and they are parasites of animals. They typically go through their life cycles. We'll spend it in a couple of different hosts, not just one. There's 4 main species that will cause most of the infections. There is a new 5th species that is classified as an emerging parasite. This includes Plasmodium, which is causative agent of malaria. Malaria is endemic throughout the tropics and subtropics, and it is a very specific type of mosquito that acts as the vector. This goes through and shows, once again, the life cycle. This map is showing where malaria, the number of cases where the outbreaks were. And as we mentioned just a bit ago, in the tropics and subtropic areas. One thing I just want to point out is look at the number of cases that are seen on the African continent. That will come up in just a little bit again. So what happens when Plasmodium infection causes malaria does secrete various toxins and enzymes in the host. The parasite itself can produce or has adhesins which helps it to stick to cells within the spleen, and that makes it more difficult to completely clear it out. It also kind of sends signals, chemical signals that tend to attract mosquitoes to bite you, and then it's able to transmit from individual to individual that way. There are a couple interesting things that are interesting in that they have found with genetics. There are certain genetic traits in individuals that they have seen in these areas where malaria is most commonly found that tends to give the individual, if you have this particular genetic trait, tends to give you some resistance against malaria, which is an interesting thing. Sickle cell is a genetic disease. It is a recessive, which means if you have two of the genes for sickle cell anemia, you have sickle cell, and that's going to cause a whole host of problems. If you only have one gene, you are referred to as a carrier for sickle cell. So you could pass that to your offspring. Do you have sickle cell anemia? No, you don't. But the interesting thing is you don't have sickle cell anemia, but by having that gene, it gives you resistance to malaria. In what group of population do we see a higher predominance of the sickle cell genetic trait? Are in Africans, which on that previous map you saw is where the highest concentration of malaria cases are. So it's a case of you certainly don't want to have sickle cell anemic disease, and you certainly don't want to pass it off, to anyone, to your offspring. But if you have that gene, it does give you protection against malaria. Having the genetic trait also for hemoglobin C gives you resistance. And there are a couple others, as you can see, that are listed there, that these certain genetic traits, if you have one of them, does give you some resistance to malaria. Some of the symptoms of malaria include fever, chills, diarrhea, headache. It tends to occur in cycles. It has to do with the lysis of your erythrocytes, and that causes anemia, weakness, and fatigue. Usually, diagnosis is going to be through identification of the Plasmodium and blood smear. There are some anti-malaria drugs that are effective. One of the biggest things is because we know it's a particular species of mosquito that transmits the Plasmodium to humans, is limit the contact with the mosquitoes. Reduce standing water so that the mosquitoes cannot breed. Use insecticides, use netting. Prevent the mosquitoes from ever biting you in the first place. Toxoplasma, there are reservoirs in both birds and mammals. Cats certainly are a definitive host. Infection is usually due to one of two ways. Either you're consuming meat that is contaminated and it's not cooked thoroughly, or you are ingesting or inhaling some of the contaminated soil. So cats are a definitive host. Most infections are going to be asymptomatic, especially in a healthy adult. Some people may show just a fever, and it's a self-limiting infection. There are two populations where this disease, toxoplasmosis, is going to be very severe. That is an AIDS patient whose obviously immune system is compromised. The other one is in developing fetus. Protozoan can cross the placental barrier, and in a developing fetus can cause abortions, stillbirth, or other catastrophic birth defects. As I said, cat is a definitive host, which means it's often in cats and in their feces. For that reason, it is recommended that a woman who is pregnant, if she has a cat as a pet that's using a litter box, she should not be the one cleaning the litter box, because you don't want to take a chance of her accidentally, as she's cleaning the litter box, if airborne spores should happen to accidentally be inhaled. So I would say that gives a pregnant woman an excuse, if she has cats, to tell someone else in the household that it's their job to clean the litter box, so that she can reduce that risk of infection to the developing fetus. And this is what the cyst looks like of the toxoplasma. If you're asymptomatic, doesn't require any treatment. There are some medications that can be used if you do have an infection. How do you avoid it? Also, like I say, have someone else clean the litter box. Cook your food. Avoid contaminated soil. Cryptosporium. Uh, Humans can carry the parasite. A healthy human is going to be asymptomatic. Usually it's contracted from drinking contaminated water. In severe cases, you can have diarrhea, headache, cramping, fluid loss. The severe cases or symptoms that you would see in a symptomatic person typically has a compromised immune system. This is what the cysts look like. There's different techniques that you can use. Usually it will be fluorescent labeled antibodies. You can treat with several different antibiotics once again. And here we go again. How do you prevent it? Well, drink clean water. Use good personal hygiene. Cyclospora is the causative agent of cyclosporasis, which is considered a new emerging disease. Infection is once again by ingesting contaminated food or drinking contaminated water. It has been linked to certain fruits sometimes. Symptoms: cramps, diarrhea, muscle ache, fever. Once again, immunocompromised patients tend to have more severe disease. You can treat with some antibiotics. Prevent. Thoroughly wash your fruits and vegetables. So this table is showing the breakdown of the 4 different groups of the protozoans. Remember, they are grouped by how they move, and the different organisms and the diseases that they cause. Now we're moving on to the helminths. These are basically worms. They also tend to have a complex life cycle. They usually have an intermediate host. There's 3 different classes of the helminths. The first class, the cestoids, are usually commonly referred to as tapeworms. They're flat. They have segments. They're intestinal parasites. Typically, this is what it looks like, each little segment. If one of those segments breaks off, it can develop into a new worm. On here you can see at the end the sucker and the hooks which help attach it to its host. Typically what happens is the eggs from the tapeworm, they are released into the environment, usually in feces. Like I say, there's usually an intermediate host that has ingested the eggs on their contaminated food. The eggs inside the intermediate host are going to hatch and form the larval stage, which then forms typically in the muscle, and this forms this what we call a cystoceras. And then if you ingest undercooked or raw meat that has basically this larval cyst in it, then that is how the infection then occurs. In the humans, And then this, in the small intestines, basically will mature into the adult worm. So there's a couple different species. Saginata is a beef tapeworm, and Tinea solium is a pork tapeworm. So either the cattle or the pig is going to be the intermediate host, and then humans who are either working close with them or if they ingest undercooked meat can become infected. Intestinal blockage can occur and may require surgery if the tapeworm does develop and is large enough. Treatment, there are some medications, some drugs that can be used to help treat. Prevention, properly cook your meat, properly freeze your meat once you have processed it. Personally, if I had a piece of meat such as this, where you saw all of these cysts in it, I might want to think twice about eating that, even if I cooked it. There is a canine tapeworm, Echococcus. Once again, dogs can become infected by eating some of the cyst forms, consuming and then humans, if they're consuming contaminated water, contaminated food, and it can cause the hydatid disease. This is where the larvae is going to travel through the body, once again form these large cysts that will continue to enlarge. Diagnosis is going to be typically by visually, like on x-ray, seeing the cyst. You can treat with drugs. Depending on the size of the cyst, you may need to surgically remove it. Once again, just good hygiene practices. Drink clean water, eat cooked food. Here in this x-ray, you can see the size of the cyst that would have to be removed surgically. Flukes are trematodes. These are also flatworms. They will attach the host by a sucker to get the nutrients. They're grouped by or classified by where they attach. So as you can see, the mouth is at one end. It's a broad worm. So a liver fluke is going to be infecting when they reside in the liver, typically near the bile duct. You can treat with antibiotics. Blood flukes. These, obviously, as the name implies, can get into the blood. It's going to cause more problems because it can move anywhere now. They can burrow through the skin initially, and then the larvae are able to get into the circulatory system. The eggs typically will develop in the intestines or the urinary bladder, sometimes in the ureters. They can end up blocking those. Typically, you end up with dermatitis, which is just a reddening, kind of a rash at where the site of where they entered. Swimmer's itch is commonly referred to where it's been contracted by water and the site of infection, the site of entry, once again, gets this rash, which is itchy. If left untreated, it can become chronic, long-term, eventually fatal. This is what an egg of it looks like. You can do identification by detecting eggs in either stool or urine samples. Good sanitation, good clean water. Nematodes, often referred to as roundworms, they do have a digestive tract of their own. Several of these are parasites on several different animals, not just humans. Oftentimes the eggs are consumed, once again, surprise, contaminated water, contaminated food. And if you don't cook your food, the eggs survive. If you were to cook it, it would kill them. The larvae are going to be able to sometimes penetrate the skin of the host. Once again, some nematodes form cysts, and they are consumed when you eat raw or undercooked meat. Ascaris, which is the genus for the worms that most of you are probably familiar with, is endemic in southeastern United States. The eggs are often ingested in contaminated water or on vegetables that aren't washed thoroughly. So you ingest the egg, the adult worms will grow. They reproduce typically in the small intestines. Most of the infections are going to be asymptomatic. However, if the infection is large enough, you can start having abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting. If there are enough worms, then it can actually block the intestines, which you would need to have surgery to remove. Here is a physician holding Ascaris that was removed from an individual's intestines. Obviously, that amount, that's a huge blockage. So how do you diagnose it? Oftentimes by seeing the presence of eggs in stool samples. Once again, you can treat with medication. You may need to do surgery. Proper sanitation, proper hygiene would prevent infections from even occurring. Hookworms are another type of nematode infection. The larvae are in soil. They can burrow through the skin. As the name implies, the adult worm is going to basically use the hook to attach to the host and suck the blood because it's got nutrients in it that it needs. It will end up long-term causing anemia, protein deficiencies, iron deficiencies. Typically, it's going to be itchy at the site of infection. This shows the mouth of a hookworm. You can see how it gets its name. Diagnosis is going to be based on if you see the presence of eggs in stool samples. And usually prior to that, individual has shown the symptoms of being anemic. Proper sanitation. Pinworms, intervies, one of the most common parasitic worms here in the United States. The female pinworms deposit their eggs in the anus. Infections can be asymptomatic. When they are symptomatic, the main symptom is going to be perianal itching. Identification of eggs or the adult worms can be used for diagnosis, treatment with antibiotics. This is what the eggs look like. Anascus simplex. Humans can be a host, usually by eating raw or undercooked fish. Healthy individuals will be asymptomatic. Some people may eventually develop an allergy towards the worm. You would do diagnosis from identification of worms in the intestines. You need to remove it from the intestines. How do you prevent it? Do not ingest raw or undercooked fish. A life cycle here is shown. There's another type of nematode that can infect the lymphatic system. This is commonly found throughout the tropic areas. The transmission is by mosquitoes once again. This is a case where you may become infected but may be asymptomatic for a long time. I'm talking for years. And because it does infect the lymphatic system, you do have damage over a long period of time to your lymphatic system, which is helping, remember, to return fluids and the extracellular fluids back into the circulatory system. So the blood, as it's going through the capillaries, you have some of the fluid that's leaking out. Not all of it gets returned immediately in the capillary bed back into the blood. So the remaining fluid that's in this interstitial space between the cells, that's what we call the lymph. And that has to be returned back to The blood circulatory system, at some point, you're trying to maintain a constant volume of blood, so you have to get that fluid back in. That's what your lymphatic system is for, as well as protection. So if you have damage to the lymphatic system, typically what you will see is swelling in different areas. So this is, you would diagnose it by finding it in blood. And then here's an example of elephantism, or this extreme swelling in the leg. Why? Because the lymphatic system has been damaged and is not able to return all that increasing fluid back into the blood. Once again, how do you prevent it? Break that link with the mosquito vector. Here is a table that is showing the various helminthic parasites and the diseases that they cause.